hello and welcome. Today's programme is all about roasting and pot roasting. But meat costs so much money nowadays that I think one very important ingredient when you're cooking meat, that's before you get into the kitchen, is to have a helpful and reliable butcher. And today I've brought my butcher along with me, Paul Bifulco, and he's going to explain a little bit about buying meat. But first of all, why is it people keep writing to me and saying they can't roast meat, Paul?
Well, basically because they don't know how to. They go into a butcher shop, they ask for a piece of meat for roasting, but they haven't got the first idea of what to do. So that's where you come in and I come in, and we try to help the public as much as we can.
As a team?
As a team.
Let's have a look at some roasting joints first. The leg of lamb.
Now here we have an example of a home-killed leg of lamb. Approximately 4.5 to 5 pounds in weight, which is a good size.
Mm-hmm.
And the points to look for in quality is a plumpness, not too long in the shank, not too fat. Now the best way to tell the fat is at the back.
Mm-hmm.
So you can just see the flesh through it and not too covering of white.
And can you show everybody that little tip you told me about buying a leg of lamb?
Well, the thing that we look for in the trade is this bone here should not be too white. It has just that little bit of redness in it.
That little red stripe.
That's it. And as the animal gets older, that disappears and the bone appears much whiter and more flinty.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I prefer a shoulder of lamb because I think you have sweeter meat on a shoulder of lamb.
Well,
Do you agree?
I agree with you, but most people go for leg because it's easier to carve, but shoulder has much nicer flavour, I think so.
And carving's no problem if you've got a really sharp
Good knife. A good knife.
What about pork?
Now, the thing to look for first in pork, if you're buying it with the crackling should be a nice flesh colour, not too much fat. As you see here, this is a good example.
A thin strip of fat.
Thin strip of fat. The crackling shouldn't be too thick, nicely scored on the back, and a good whitish, pinkish flesh colour.
Yes. Nice scoring is important, sometimes very badly scored.
This is very important in the cooking as well.
It's good for good crackling. And you can roast any piece of pork, can't you? That is
a blade bone of pork. That is very, very nice flavour.
And more economical than that one.
It costs less per pound, yes.
Has a lovely flavour. Now, moving on to beef and pot roasting. But first of all, we've got a piece of, this is topside here, isn't it?
That's topside, yes.
You can, in fact, roast topside.
Now, topside can be roasted or it can be pot roasted, but if you're going to roast it, it does need careful cooking. You can be unlucky with topside. If you don't cook it properly, it's going to come out tough.
Mm-hmm. I prefer to pot roast a piece of topside.
Yes.
But why is it? This is my favourite pot roasting joint here.
Well, this is Delia's favourite. It's brisket.
Yes.
A rolled brisket of beef.
Lovely flavour.
Good flavour.
And brisket is, in fact, from the breast, isn't it?
That is it.
Why is it, in fact, that you can pot roast but can't roast these cuts of meat?
Well, because if you're using a cheaper cut of meat from the forequarter, basically it's mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
The animal is using those muscles to manoeuvre. So it's going to be...
The forequarter?
The forequarter.
From my waist up?
That's it. It's going to be much tougher.
And but long, slow cooking with all that connective tissue inside makes it more succulent,
yes.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
Now we're into the big business.
Now we come on to the...
Did you have an armed escort when you came with that? That is your actual good old English...
English sirloin beef. This is a Scotch...
Beautiful.
Piece of Scotch sirloin of beef.
Lovely.
With the bone in. And this is a particularly good example with nice marbling fat. You see the marbling fat between...
Which bastes it whilst
it's cooking. Will help
with
the internal basting and
yes.
a good layer of fat on the outside. Not too much. You see here that this is a good... Not more than that. That is a good example.
And good Scotch beef is free range, grass-fed.
Grass-fed. Good cattle.
Yes. And that's the fillet, is it there?
That is the fillet there.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the eye of the meat there and the fillet there with the bone running through. This is actually also called T-bone. You cut a steak off of that, it's a T-bone steak.
Do you agree with me that meat is better cooked on the bone?
I think so, definitely. You get a much nicer flavour.
Yes, that's why I like this one. That's my
favourite. Well, now we come on to our traditional roast beef of Old England, wing end of sirloin.
That's a wing rib.
A wing rib or wing end of sirloin.
And that's a very large piece. That's 3 ribs.
There's a 3-bone rib, yes. Probably too big for the average household. But it is a really succulent piece of meat.
Well, thanks for coming along, Paul, and explaining all that. I hope that everybody watching can find a good, reliable butcher. I must say I don't ever have any worries about buying
That's
meat
the answer.
with you around. Well, we've had a look at meat uncooked. Now, I want to show you, on speeded up film, a piece of meat actually cooking in the oven and explain to you what happens. You can see the outside crust forming. This doesn't seal in the juices, but it does give a lovely crisp texture and flavour to the outside. And you can just see some of those juices escaping and the meat shrinking under the heat. Well, that's what it looks like inside the oven. Before it goes in the oven, I want to just show you a few tips about roasting meat. First of all, you need a good, solid roasting pan. And what I do with beef is I give it a coating of a little bit of flour. I sprinkle it with flour and a little bit of mustard powder as well. Sprinkle that on, and then just rub it into the surface of the fat so that whilst it's cooking, it gets a good blast of heat at the beginning, and then it gets a nice brown crust on the top, which is very crispy by the time it comes out of the oven. A little bit of pepper too. Then you put a bit of beef dripping in the pan, and I want to make the point, when you're roasting, always try and use the fat that matches the meat, like beef dripping for beef and so on. And let that melt when it goes into the oven. And then what old-fashioned cooks, why they were so wise, was because what they did when their meat was roasting on the spit or wherever, they basted it all the time. And this is what I think really makes a roast joint taste succulent and have good flavour, and that's continual basting. And this is a good piece of kitchen equipment, a long-handled spoon, because when you go into the oven and baste it, you don't get burnt if you've got a nice long handle on the spoon. So baste it for as many times as you're able to throughout the cooking. Well, that's what to do with a lovely piece of roast beef. The next thing you need to do, I think, you might not agree with me, is make a Yorkshire pudding. And so now I want to show you how easy it is to make a Yorkshire. Well, first of all, you need 3 ounces of plain flour. And don't use self-raising flour, that's very important, because you're going to use a raising agent, and that's an egg. So pop in an egg. Then in my measuring jug here, I've got 3 fluid ounces of milk and 2 fluid ounces of water. And I'm going to add those to that mixture when the egg is mixed in. And I always prefer to use a mixture of water and milk, because I find you get a lighter Yorkshire pudding if you do it like that, rather than using all milk. So just whisk the egg into the flour to start off with. I haven't got my beaters on there properly, which is a disaster, so I'll just fix that on. And then, once the egg is mixed in, you can start to add the milk and water bit by bit. If you haven't got an electric hand whisk, don't worry. You can do it with a fork or with any other sort of whisk. If you find you've got little lumps around the edge that haven't gone into the whisk, just go round it like that with a spatula and then give it another final little whisking to whisk those lumps in. Next thing you need is a little bit of salt and some freshly milled pepper, and if you want to, you can add a few mixed herbs, which does make a slightly different Yorkshire pudding. Now you need a hot roasting pan with hot dripping in it, so you have that ready in the oven. I'll just get that out. It's important to use a good, thick, solid pan. I've got a cast iron enamel one here, but whatever you use, it must be a nice, thick, solid one. And never use glass or porcelain, always use metal of some sort. Then you place it onto direct heat, so that when the batter hits the fat, it really is absolutely piping hot, and that's what makes a good Yorkshire pudding. So from the oven, onto direct heat, and then just pour the batter in. Now that goes straight back, post-haste, into the oven, and it's a very hot oven, gas mark 7. That's 425 degrees Fahrenheit, and it'll take about 20 to 25 minutes to cook. And we've got one ready now. And that's the finished Yorkshire pudding, nice and crisp and puffy. And one last thing I'd like to tell you, and that is when you make a Yorkshire pudding, do serve it straight away. It doesn't like hanging around. It goes a bit soggy if it hangs around. Well, that's the good old roast beef of England. If you're rich enough to have one that size. If you want a smaller family-sized joint, I think a piece of loin of pork would be very nice. And I've got a recipe here that's good for a dinner party, I think, called loin of pork Dijonnaise. And for this, I have asked the butcher to score the meat for me so that it's got those nice scores in it all the way across, and that's very important for the crackling. Now, I get a lot of letters about people who can't cook crackling, or they complain they can't, so I just want to point out that you put that in a hot oven plain as it is, and you put salt on it, that's all, and you'll never have any problems with the crackling. But for this recipe, I'm going to remove the crackling and cook it separately, but I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I've taken it off with a knife first, keeping half the fat on the crackling and leaving the other half on the pork. And so this is going to be cooked separately, so it'll just go onto a baking tin, like that, the scored crackling, and be sprinkled quite liberally with salt. Now, I think where people go wrong with crackling is they sort of plaster it with butter and lard and all sorts of things. And pork has a lot of fat of its own, so you never need to really add fat to pork. Now, the salt will draw some of the moisture out and make it really crisp. So hot oven, gas mark 7, that's 400 degrees Fahrenheit, put it on the top shelf, and in about 20 minutes, you'll have nice, crisp crackling like that, really crisp and really crunchy and very, very light, not chewy at all. So if you cook it on the pork or off the pork, the principles are the same. You must have a good hot oven. If you haven't got a hot oven or something's gone wrong, and at the end of the cooking time you haven't got the crackling, then just put it under the grill. That's a tip. A nice good blast under the grill will soon crackle it up for you. Well, this is going to be loin of pork Dijonnaise, and crackling having been cooked separately, the first thing I'm going to do is add some other flavours to the pork before it goes in the oven. And first of all, I've got here some Dijon mustard. And this is French mustard that's made with wine and herbs and fairly widely available. If you haven't got or don't like Dijon mustard, then you can make this recipe with ordinary English mustard, which is every bit as good. So give it a good coating of mustard. And then I've got some other flavourings here. First of all, I've got breadcrumbs, which is going to give a crisp finish. And to the breadcrumbs, I'm going to add a teaspoonful of sage, which is a good partner for pork, and a teaspoonful of crushed peppercorns. And these have been crushed coarsely, more coarsely than they would be if they were from a pepper mill. And you can do that either in a pestle and mortar, or you can crush them with a rolling pin, or just put them on a flat surface and use the back of a tablespoon. Now I'm going to coat the pork with that mixture, and then just pat it all in, and you'll find that it will stay because you've got the mustard as a sort of a glue. And then, if you spend a bit more time than I've got time for now, you can reincorporate all those bits, patting them over and keeping them well in. Now, that goes into a preheated oven in a roasting tin with a piece of foil over it at gas mark 5, that's 375 degrees, and it'll take 2 hours to cook. But remember, at the end of the cooking time, to remove the foil half an hour before the end of the cooking time, just to get a nice brown crust on it. But we've got one ready to come out now, so we'll get that. There we have it. 2 hours in time taken care of. And if you have a warm serving plate ready to put it onto, like that there. Then the juices in the pan are very nice if you rinse that round, spoon off any fat, rinse it round with some dry cider. Half a pint of dry cider would make a lovely gravy, an apple-flavoured gravy to go with that. And then garnish it with the crackling, which you can just break up into pieces to divide up so that everybody gets a nice piece of crackling. And then here, I've got some fried apple rings. And these are just Cox's apples, cored, but I've left the peel on because I think that looks pretty and you have better flavour. And fried them so that they've still got a bit of bite, not too soft. And put those round the edge and then garnish it with some watercress to make it look pretty. And serve the gravy separately. And I think that's a very nice dinner party recipe. Well, the recipe for that is in the book. My hands are a bit sticky, so I've got to hold that with a cloth. The recipe for that is in the book, along with lots of other roasting recipes, and also recipes for pot roasting, which is what we're moving on to now. Well, first of all, you need my favourite piece of beef for pot roasting is brisket, as I said earlier, but any good pot roasting joint will do. And the principles of pot roasting are, instead of putting the meat in the oven and just applying a lot of heat to it, you cook it very slowly with some liquid so that the liquid provides moisture and it's inside an enclosed pot and it keeps it nice and succulent and juicy when you're ready to serve it. Now, before it goes into the pot, the fat needs to be browned and charred to give it a nice crisp flavour. So that's what I've done with this joint here. I've browned it, again, in beef dripping, and got it nice and brown all the way around the edge in a frying pan. And now I'm just going to transfer that over to my cooking pot. There we are. Now, in the fat left in the frying pan, after you've browned your piece of beef, you then brown some vegetables to put all round it. And I've got these already fried here. I've got some pieces of swede, some nice chunks of celery. Have the vegetables nice and chunky because they're going to be in the pot for quite a long time. I've also got some whole onions, which have been browned, small onions. And that's going to be tucked all around the meat, like that. Now, the next thing I've got are some mushrooms. And I'd like to make a point about mushrooms. I've got 1/4 pound of mushrooms here. But the point I want to make is that, if possible, try and get dark gilled mushrooms. These are the fully matured mushrooms, and they have a much better flavour than the sort of very tiny little button ones that don't seem to taste of anything. So dark gilled mushrooms, if you can find them, open ones. And these are rather big, so I'm going to break them up a little bit. If you've got small mushrooms, you can put them in whole. Now, we've got some other flavourings. It needs to have some salt and pepper. Also, I'm going to put some sprigs of thyme. I've got fresh thyme here, which grows quite profusely in my garden, but you can use dried thyme instead if you like, about, I should say, 1/2 teaspoonful. Now I'm going to use a bay leaf. I've got a big one, so I'll break it in half. So there we have everything enclosed in the pot. All it needs now is some liquid. Well, you can use stock. You could even use water, but you can use stock or red wine or white wine. And something else that's very good for pot roasting is dry cider, not sweet cider, dry cider. But what I'm going to use today is one of my favourites, and that's good old-fashioned stout. And I find that if you cook meat in beer, any sort of beer, but for this one I like stout, the long, slow cooking really transforms that stout into the most delicious flavour, and it fills the whole kitchen with beautiful aroma and absolutely transforms the flavour of everything. So that's my favourite, and that's the liquid I'm going to use today. It's not much liquid, but it just needs to be enough to provide some steam to cook everything. Now that goes into a very slow oven, gas mark 1 or its equivalents, and it'll take 3 hours. If you haven't got a tight-fitting lid on your casserole, then line it with a bit of foil or something, because it needs to be tight fitting. The nice thing about pot roasting is that you can go off and do whatever you want to do for 3 hours and come back and have the Sunday lunch already. It leaves you in peace. Well, that'll come out of the oven after 3 hours, but I just want to show you something before we look at the pot roast, and that is, if you've got some juices left over from anything that you're making and you want to thicken the juices, and I'd just like to show you how to do that. I mean, you might well prefer to serve the juices just as they are, but if you want them a little bit thicker, then what you do is you spoon off all the fat from the top using a tablespoon, just skim the fat off. And then the juices that are left, you pour them into a saucepan like I've done here, and then put it over direct heat, and you add this to it. This is called beurre manier, which is a butter and flour mixture. It's a tablespoon of butter and a tablespoon of flour, and that's been worked to a paste. And what I'm going to do is just pop that into the mixture in order to thicken it. And I'm going to now use a whisk and just very gently whisk that into the juices. Don't worry about lumps. You won't get any lumps with this because you have worked the flour into the butter, and it's the flour and butter together that stops the flour going into lumps, and also the whisk. And I'd like you to see that now, and to see how that's really much, much thicker, much, much more like a sauce than what we saw before. So anyway, that's a butter and flour thickening, which is useful to know how to do. But now we'll just get the finished pot roast out and have a look at it. You really need about 10 arms to be a cook. There we are then. That will fill your kitchen with a beautiful aroma. We'll serve that cut in slices with the vegetables spooned all around it and the juices over the top. And I think that eats very well with a bit of sharp English mustard on the table.